The Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher by Jane Roberts. Chapter 2. Depression, Precognition, and the Dynamics of Creativity. Monday evening, as the snow fell, our new kitten raced through the living room, and my husband Rob painted in his studio. I sat down at the typewriter and started up again. With the first words, I knew that James was beginning a new chapter. He never gave any chapter headings, so I titled them myself when we were done. Monday evening, January 31st, 1977. In life, the dynamics of creativity are hidden from us in a way that logical thought processes are not. A splendid natural scene, a strain of music, or the contemplation of a great painting often stirs the emotions in a seemingly miraculous fashion, so that suddenly an individual's overall personality is altered. Faith replaces doubt. Vibrant health retones the body. Intellectual faculties, before strained by anxiety, are quickened, sharpened, and yet filled out with a new power, attaining an additional substance or thickness of content. Such experiences appear in small or grand manner in each lifetime, sometimes so seemingly insignificant that they nearly go unnoticed, perhaps not even changing our plans for the day, though altering the cast of those events in the gentlest, kindest way, or occurring as revelations that completely rewrite the script of a lifetime's future actions. We cannot account for such experiences intellectually, for the same scene that so inexplicably fires out emotions and rouses our awe may be one that we have passed, unaffected, countless times. The painting may have earlier struck us as a quite mundane. The painting may have earlier struck us as quite mundane, and we may have heard that particular strain of music so often in the past that we automatically ceased hearing it for all practical purposes. The opposite can also occur when an innocuous scene strikes us with sudden, sharp desolation. The sight of a masterpiece plunges us into deep depression, or the strains of a familiar piece of music unaccountably touches off a melancholy, all the more desperate because it seems so out of proportion to the triggering event. I used to think that the somber New England landscape accounted for my melancholy to some extent, for the feeling of my consciousness at times mirrored perfectly the cold, gray bleakness of the world outside my cozy study. The ships coming to port sounded a mournful note, as if the sorrowful dead, particularly at twilight, made a ring, arms entwined, gazing toward the land with nostalgic despair, filling the air with the sound of their dirge, a sound that merged with the ocean's roar, the ship's foghorns, and the whistlings and the rattlings of the cold waves. Romantic, sentimental, floppy fantasies. My intellect held me up to scorn for them, and I would confess them to no one, staunchly reminding myself of the harbor's lusty bustle. I would imagine the lights, commotion, and shouts of the sailors. I would try to smell the odor of the day's catch, so to hear the thumping and returning feet on the slippery wooden docks, and to see the barrels of cold water thrown over the glistening nets of fish. For all this, I had experienced often on long walks, and I always found the entire affair quite refreshing. Yet, when that particular fantasy overcame me, I was mentally struck instead by the sight of blind fish eyes, staring upward, slimy weathered rocks, the heavy, yet now distasteful indifference of the fishermen for the wriggling catch beneath their booted feet. Was it for this scene-cluttered desolation? No, sorry, let me start that over again. Was it for this sense-cluttered desolation, this gluttonous denial of life for other creatures, that the dead yearned? I wondered in such moods about what life could possibly attract the dead, who were cleansed of such petty violences, who were absolved from the clamor of conflicting desires, in which victory for one was despair for another. For while I yearned toward comradeship and found conversation the liveliest and most civilized of social pursuits, I was also on other occasions sickened by the same sense of discourse and the same companions that at other times gave me the deepest satisfaction. So, why my fantasy of the wailing dead? During such attacks of desolation, I felt too fastidious for life, even outraged by its conditions, drawn toward a life of solitary contemplation. Yet such contemplation, I reasoned, would only deepen my distress, and quite in line with my feelings, rather than any intellectual attitude towards them, out of nowhere there would emerge a barrage of dire images, gathered together in lightning swiftness from my entire experience, tragic events of my life, or from novels I had read, or dramas I had seen, images instantly brought to somber yet brilliant life that only moments before had been buried in my memory. My feelings had literally conjured these images into fresh existence, searched through all the important and trivial data with which I had been concerned from birth, and presented these to me with a priceless organization that consciously would have been quite beyond my means if I were asked to draw up such a list of associations. The extent of such images seemed endless, providing a steady procession of tragic mini-dramas, each deepening my morass, until finally I simply refused to entertain them any longer and forcibly turned my attention elsewhere. What unwanted guests of the unconscious, what unbidden demonic company. So I told myself, admitting no responsibility at all for their arrival and insisting instead that I was put upon by the dictates of a melancholy temperament that was mine, but not me. I, unduly fascinated also with the progression of generations in their twofold fashion, for each generation followed the previous one into life and into death, some like strange mermaids and mermen lifting above the surface of the waters, but without ever losing the fins of their true specieshood, and falling back into the ocean's depths after but a glimpse of the land. For surely, I reasoned, we were dead for longer than we lived, and how could life's brief iridescent light shed any real illumination into that vast darkness that surrounded life on all sides? But how strange, I thought, that life's concentrated focus was so full of conflicts, tumults, divisions, and questions that seemed by their nature to have in life no possibility to resolve. Did one life possess enough stimuli to satisfy the dead for untold centuries? Did the dead mull upon their life's experiences, gnaw mentally upon the bones of their own contention? Was life like some unspeakable, uncomplicated problem? In emotional mathematics, each soul given one and then sent back into the realms of non-being, where the concentration was expanded in some equally inexplicable way. But to what point? So all of these thoughts assailed me as I heard the ships come into port, in direct contradiction to my conscious experience of the docks, and in spite of my cheerful appreciation of the fishermen's gusty diligence when I actually visited there. And if the dead did possess such secrets, if their mental mullings of their life's events gave them any solutions, none certainly appeared in the seances I attended, nor did any of my investigations of such affairs bring me comfort. The existence of clairvoyance and telepathic dreams was another matter. And though no real objective evidence could be ascertained, in my opinion there was no doubt that man's mind could and did peer into the mind of another, and could also at times perceive the intent of the future. It struck me further, from the dream reports we collected, that dream events come together or were conjured up in the same way that my own dark waking fantasies were. Where my images were confined to events from the past or present of my own experience, however, such dream images reached into future events and often involved experiences that were not personal. In this respect, the dreamer's mind sought from an interpersonal field of relationships those images that formed the dream, but organized them according to some hidden inner intent. The dream events seemed to just fall together, as did my fantasies, organized with an inner facility beyond normal conscious means, and utilizing a far vaster field of information than is normally at hand. It occurred to me that dreams were notorious mood changers, and this whether or not the dream events proved true. That is, the dream effects were often undeniable and led to definite behavior changes, even though the dream events themselves were not precognitive. I reasoned then that those who were, like me, of melancholy temperament, but also more gifted, might dream their desperate fantasies only with an extra, far more creative twist, so that the details unconsciously chosen came not from private past or present experience, but were the results of a far more extensive ferreting in which the future also served. The private sense of disaster, I believed, could be of such intensity, the anticipation of danger so acute, that some individuals, in an accelerating, sleeping state of creativity, sought out those data from the future involving others not themselves, collected predictive elements and dreamed events that were about to happen in the objective world. But to what purpose? For surely precognitive dreams of disasters must lead to feelings of helplessness and confusion. How to warn the unknown passengers of a train that on the tracks ahead lies a certain collision. Into what depths of suspense must the dreamer of such tragedy be plunged, caught wondering and waiting to see whether or not the disaster will in fact occur. Imagine such a man or woman worriedly scanning newspapers for such reports, questioning if the dream could in any way be responsible for the ensuing events if they do occur. So what psychological value would such a dream provide? I found some answers late in life, though, examining my own dire fantasies, though they were waking ones and not precognitive. Some of us, more than others it seems, are struck by a sense of life's vulnerability, and though we may learn to display the hearty, everyday manner of our more blustery neighbors, we quail, cringe, and protest against the characteristics of life that others quite take for granted. A bird with a broken wing, a caught fish, dumb mouth open, the household kitten trailing the dead mouse, blood splattered yet protected from crime by his innocence, and the bouts of illness with which children are often afflicted. Those injustices forever capture our notice. How we envy the bustling mother who reacts in a practical manner, certain that tomorrow the child will be outdoors at play, while we see the funeral in our mind's eye and imagine the crying relatives. In any case, there are those of us who in life expect the worst, whose very blood would seem to have a dull gray cast, whose freshest thoughts are tinged by regrets and overconscientiousness. Such is the certainty of disaster that in any given day, if none is found, the pressure grows. For from what hidden avenue might life's retribution come? Any excuse at all to have such a feeling upon is better than none. Fantasies will serve. If the melancholy person hides that anxiety from himself, promptly, with moral rectitude, dismissing such sentiments as unworthy, then perhaps in sleep, that need triggers creativity to such an extent that the dreamer reaches into the future for an event to pin his anxieties on, and hence to express them. If the foreseen event involves others and not himself, what a sense of relief. Disaster, yes, the dreamer was right, and his feelings of anxiety were justified, while he himself is saved. The foreseen catastrophe also provides a continuing drama, as the anticipated events are nervously awaited, so that the melancholic feelings of which the individual is ashamed can find a carrier to hold their content. The artistically gifted might instead paint a dark landscape of swirling storm clouds, or disaster at sea, or some other painting whose deep shadows and stern visage suggest the despairing passions. The poet might write a somber verse, a dirge or ode to death. But the hidden creature powers lie beneath all these achievements, despite their content, method, or final form, and behind the creative powers lie the majestic energies of the emotions, those same emotions that I envied in others during my life, while I treated them like psychological stepchildren in myself, unless they paraded in their best Sunday clothes. It was only after death that I understood life's full achievement, appreciated the fine focus of consciousness. returned so precisely and triumphantly to one place and time, and felt the power of earth-dimensioned life, as in life I had never known it. As a result, I came to terms with my own spirit and gave it its freedom, while in life I overtended it, believing it was ill, served by mortality's experience. It is to comment upon that earthly experience that I now once again shape the components of my consciousness into that general cast they once possessed, and adopt to some extent the characteristic bent of thought by which my works were known. To do so will at least hint of those creative aspects of personality that lie beneath each life and allow it to reach into dimensions other than its own, out of strength and power of its own intent. In life, I was of course aware of those with cheerful temperament, whose natural feelings, left alone, were optimistic, those who seemed genuinely content, and I envied them, even while suspecting that they were of shallow mind, given to easy emotions, while blind to the passions. Or I romanticized them on other occasions as natural man, human, but as innocent of moral challenge as the kitten or tiger. The idea of the life force intrigued me, and I could envision it in man or woman or child, or in the individual, but had the greatest difficulty in perceiving this existence in any given person, and while I theorized about its force, I felt within myself only the probing need to feel that power I imagined any simple animal possessed. I looked, therefore, for its evidence in others and in the experience of paranormal events as they were reported to me, and largely ignored the thrusting drive of my own emotional life, which struck me then as an impediment of sentiment against which I must exert all the energy of my will. Let me read that sentence again. I looked, therefore, for its evidence in others and in the experience of paranormal events as they were reported to me, and largely ignored by the thrusting drive of my own emotional life, which struck me then as an impediment of sentiment against which I must exert all the energy of my will and intellect. I wanted to examine the emotions without feeling them, study the nature of creativity while holding myself aloof from its full sway, explore the force of life by standing apart in lofty isolation, promote the brotherhood of democratic man while confining my personal relationships to the scholarly, and most of all, to find scientific evidence for the belief in God by assiduously maintaining an objective stance against any emotional belief that might jeopardize the framework of disbelief that made the search itself respectable. Some of this intellectual posturing was in response to the times, yet, to however weak an extent, I molded the times in turn, marking them with a stamp of temperament and belief, even as my contemporaries each did, and also, to some extent, those characteristics uneasily mirrored the generation that came before, that believed in faith, good works, the hand of man's destiny, and yet in the face of tumultuous growing industrial events, dared not criticize the daily national experience their faith had wrought. If God was in the heaven and all was right with the world, and if democracy was the favored form of government, divinely protecting men's rights and freedoms, if free employment and competition were the answers to poverty and the class systems of European heritage, then what about child labor and the notorious conditions in factories and sweat houses? So we were often torn between faith and doubt, fascination with technology, and an alternating romanticization of nature, uneasy between the overly sentimental and the overly critical stance. In my study, isolated with books, my trusted companions, I theorized most easily and readily about the brotherhood of man, while personal encounters often left me annoyed and despairing and led me to question those moral principles that I followed in my mind, but found so difficult to experience when I met face to face with my fellow men.